When one considers what adults are always concerned about, it's one of three things. Money is a big one. Food, diet, etc. It's pretty big. And of course, sex and relationships. That's pretty big too. So these three concerns that we have are prevalent to every human being, especially adults, for much of their lives. The mind dwells on these three aspects much of the time. Now, here's an essay by my teacher. There he is when he was young, Franklin Jones. He's known as Adi Da.The now. He passed away in 2008. So this chapter from the Method of the Siddhas is called Money, Food and Sex. He uses a few sort of Sanskrit words, which I'll try and explain. I think I'll have to record it in two parts. He says, there are patterns in our individual lives that are responsible for the quality of tamas, or inertia, immobility, sluggishness, the backlog of everything. The earliest period of a spiritual life, or life in relationship to one's spiritual master, deals especially with this tamasic condition, the inertia of the disciple or devotee, his tendency to remain in or return to the very state of suffering and ignorance in which he began. Often the thousands of devotees, disciples that come to a spiritual practice, haven't sorted out these three aspects of their lives. They haven't got their house in order, as it were. And often the reason why we come to a spiritual practice or teacher is because of our, more often than not, inner suffering and the ignorance that we try to counter by getting some real wisdom. So when you are capable of functioning, that is when spiritual life begins. Until then, it doesn't make any difference how many times you come to see me, the spiritual teacher, or how many lectures you hear. Now is the time to begin to live. And to live is to be responsible for your life, not to continue old patterns. The spiritual master cannot release you from responsibility. How can he release you from the responsibility of your own breath? So when people become involved in any kind of religious or spiritual activity, particularly a group activity of some sort, there are a few subtle notions that tend automatically to be awakened in them. There is a subtle suggestion that spiritual life has something to do with separation from vital and physical life. Indeed, in many of the ancient traditions, that is exactly what it was. Spiritual life was an exclusive and terminal inward turning, getting away from all of the life force, the life form, the life mind, the life appearance, the life sensation, into some inward, subtle non-life perception of vision, heaven, or whatever. Because this traditional association of ideas tends to be blanketed over everything that looks like religion, spirituality, yoga and the like, every demand, every quality suggested within religious and spiritual life that involves the physical and vital being meets immediate resistance. Money, and in general, the commitment of life force in the forms of effort and love, food and sex, are the essential activities of life. Those are the vital processes, the forms of vital appearance and function. And money, food and sex are the first things that people begin to resist or manipulate when they get involved in anything that is even remotely like religion or spirituality. Religious people, for the most part, are extremely confused and guilty about money, food, and sex. People involved in spirituality, yoga, and esoteric religion are endlessly involved with experiments about money, food, and sex. What are such people always doing? Should I or shouldn't I? What is the right diet? Fasting, macrobiotics, no food, renunciation, poverty. They are on and off the food all the time, on and off sex. They may be celibate for years in order to get enlightened, but then, just as dramatically, they are seeking the tantric bliss or the restoration of mental health in perpetual orgasmic exercise. Then there are all of the other games of self-denial, no work, no income. All of these things arise whenever anything like spirituality or religion comes into a person's life. Because of the automatic resistances built into religious and spiritual endeavour, the practical need for money and for the means of survival is a very complicated and frustrated affair for even the most sophisticated religious and spiritual groups. But all of this should be a very obvious matter. We are not in heaven. This is the earth. Everything here costs life, effort, and money. It costs a great deal of life, effort, and money to maintain any religious or spiritual community. The purposes may be spiritual, but as a living community, it must fulfill the same functional laws as any household and any business cooperation. Even so, whenever practical demands are made for effort, commitment, love, or money, people tend to lapse into the tamasic mood. Such reluctance retards life, and the ability of an individual or a group to transcend this tendency is the measure of freedom and survival. There is a suspicion that if you are spiritual, you are not supposed to need money. You are not supposed to require anything, and you are supposed to abandon. The functions of life. Obviously, though, money is needed in most circumstances, and work, force, love, and energy are necessary for functional survival. Why isn't it obvious then? Why isn't it patently the responsibility of individuals that they bring life and commitment to their own religious or spiritual community, that they take on its creative work and contribute a responsible amount of money for its continuation? Why isn't that obvious? Why is there always so much wheeling and dealing involved with any religious and spiritual organization? It is because of the traditional illusion of spiritual attainment, which is pictured as a kind of evaporation process, wherein you become more and more elusive and finally disappear inside your something or dissolve into your someplace else. Now, there are people who teach that such goals are truth. If that is the game you want to play, you must go to such people. There are few and always fewer responsibilities at the level of life involved in such teachings. A certain amount of food must be taken, but some teachers have even suggested that if you begin a fast and never eat anything, at death you will merge into the enlightened state. So they have handled that side of it too. Such enlightenment is a cave without money, food, or sex. If that seems to represent the truth to you, then go to the forest and fast until death. I think this traditional orientation is utter nonsense. I do not teach it, and I do not support it. The truth that already is the case is the truth from this one's point of view. I live very naturally in the human world, and its responsibilities do not make me unspiritual. Its responsibilities are a creative manifestation requiring intelligence. All life conditions are forms of relationship. All of life is ordinary. A man who is incapable of his ordinariness has even begun to become involved in spiritual life as subtlety. The first level of spiritual life or spiritual discipline that I had to endure with a human teacher wasn't any sort of otherworldly yoga, nor did it involve love and acknowledgement from the spiritual master, or even kind words. I spent about 2 minutes with my teacher, Rudy, when I first met him. He told me to get a job and come back in 1 year, but I was perfectly willing to do that. As it happened, within a month or two later, my spiritual work with him did begin. It wasn't in fact necessary for me to be away a year, but I was perfectly willing for it to be so. I was ecstatically happy to have made this contact, to have a beginning, to have become capable of spiritual life. It was a profound joy to me to have found someone who was obviously capable of drawing me into a condition at least more profound than the one I was living. From that moment, it was one demand on top of another. It was work. Work was the spiritual practice. Work was my spiritual life. There was no come to me and sit and chat. It was take out the garbage, sweep out the place. If I came to sit and talk with Rudy, I was most often told, scrub the floor, or there is new shipment in the warehouse, so go and unload my truck. I worked constantly, day and night, for 4 years. On top of the heavy physical labour, my teacher Rudy had me go into seminaries where I studied Christian theology, masses of historical literature, ancient languages, all kinds of things in which I had no fundamental interest. I had to live in Protestant and Orthodox seminaries, but I was not a Christian. My spiritual practice was continuous work and self-transcendence. There was no ending of it. Even in sleep and dreams, there was no ending of it. My time with Rudy did not see the fulfillment of my spiritual life. I moved on to other relationships, and the order of my sadhana, my spiritual life, and my understanding changed. But His requirements for sadhana in the functions of life and body, in terms of money, food and sex, were more than useful to me. The spiritual life performed in those years became the very foundation of my spiritual life. During that time, I was strengthened and stabilized in mind, body and life. When I came to Rudy, I wasn't prepared for an elusive yogi. Such a one could have been of no use to me in the beginning. Truth is resurrected from the ground up. The conscious force can never leave the ground if you begin your sadhana in the air. If sadhana is begun as an effort to become spiritual, then what is merely alive remains a mass of confusion and craziness. So I must insist that all who come to me take on functional responsibility for the powers of life, which are money, food and sex. My way of working with people is to take hold of them and establish a relationship with them, so that this relationship becomes their conscious, overwhelming and continuous condition. When they become conscious of it on any level, then I give them responsibilities at that level. From that moment, I require and expect them to function at that level. I never pat them on the part of the head again. I expect them to live that function responsibly in the community and everywhere in life from that point on. I expect all of you who are already with me to do sadhana at the levels of money, food and sex. And to do sadhana on those levels is, at times, going to be just as difficult for you as it was for me. If you are ready for spiritual life, you will be very happy to have something in your hand at last, to function at last, to have begun. All other responses to this sadhana, your unreadiness, your unwillingness, your resistance, they are narcissus. Narcissus has no support from the heart, from the guru, from the truth, or even from the universe. Narcissus is already dead. Death is his karma, his destiny, his realization. And everyone will only die who lives as Narcissus. Narcissus will die in your own pocket. His head will fall from a sleeve. He will not die a sublime death. He will die alone, unconscious for a long time. He is the destiny of unconsciousness, of foolishness, but all waking comes suddenly. People have become involved with all kinds of patterns of life that are their suffering. Your sadhana involves that level of complication or suffering that you are already living. It doesn't necessarily involve visions. Even if visions appear, they have no ultimate consequence. Suffering is the place of sadhana. Sadhana meets this complication, this resistance, this fear, this stupidity, this lethargy, this craziness, this violence, separateness, this heaviness, this endless distraction by the current of experience from hour to hour. All of that is terrifying if you could consciously see it. Sadhana is involved with that. It requires a great deal of a person. It requires him ultimately to be a genius, a hero. It requires him to manifest the great qualities, the greatest human qualities. Everyone who does sadhana must manifest those qualities in his own life. Of course, it is not all required or even possible in one afternoon, but functional intelligence must manifest at a certain level, even at the beginning. Spiritual life is not a form of consolation. Its foundation is not a fascinating promise. It is not generated in the form of get along, do the best you can, and after death you will go to heaven, or I will come again and make everything all right. no matter what you do, because everything is really okay, you rascal. There is a profound sense in which everything is really all right, even now, regardless of the conditions, but that profundity requires the most radical kind of humour, intelligence and discipline to be understood. So a man must become responsive at the simplest level, the level in which he is living, in which he exists. There is nothing very profound about it, and this requires him to conduct or make lawful use of the life force, not to abandon it, not to become separate from it. He must become capable of relationship at the level of the vital, on all the levels of physical being, ultimately including the whole range of psychophysical life. When there is no obstruction to relationship, there is no praise or no blame. There is no praise, no blame in the responsible, appropriate enjoyment of sex relationship. There is no praise, no blame in vitality itself, nor in the appropriate management and enjoyment of food. In the earning and use of money, there is no praise, no blame, nor in the creative exercise of power and creativity, in the use of functional ability and force. But the man who is living in the pattern of separation is enormously complicated in the functions of money, food, and sex. Most of the problems he perceives in his own case have to do with money, food, and sex. The mishandling of those three things manifests as poverty and lawsuits, hoarding and financial complications, ill health, and compulsions at the level of food and sex. Those are the daily experience of the usual man. The daily round is a complication of money, food, and sex. Sri Ramana Krishna used to say, women and gold were the chief distractions and sources of bondage. He was perhaps a member of the school of getting away from the vital, but he was right about women and gold. The functions of money and sex. And we must include food in the list. These are the areas in which suffering is most apparent. Therefore, a person's life becomes very complicated to the degree that he has not understood the vital processes, to the degree he is living the life of Narcissus in relation to money, food, and sex. Simply because you have come to this community, this ashram, and have expressed a certain willingness to begin this radical life, does not mean that you have ceased to live in the usual sense, in the usual way. Since you came here, you have begun to observe the resistances that are in you, the reluctance to function in at least human terms, all of the craziness and the forms of crisis that make it all so very apparent at times. So it hasn't disappeared simply because you are here. But the process that undermines all of that has begun. Satsang does not, that's relationship with spiritual master, Satsang does not support the forms of your reluctance, your tamasic tendencies. These things remain to occupy you until a different intelligence replaces them. And that is precisely what this work is all about. In the meantime, while you are all still a little nutty, you must survive in time and space. Indeed, the ashram itself must survive. Therefore, rather than have the ashram accommodate itself to resistance, your responsibilities must be made plain. What is appropriate must be made known in a simple way, and all who come here must be required to function at that level immediately. People think they are supposed to be allowed a little time to get through all of their functional problems. They are supposed to analyze it for a few years until under very supportive conditions and get it a little bit straight about 2, 3, maybe 4 years from now. But that has nothing whatsoever to do with the truth. It is only another sign of reluctance, inertia, tamas. Spiritual life is not the support of your malfunctioning with a few little bits of wisdom thrown in until you come out of it. Spiritual life is sadhana, the always present demand of function. How do you think the spiritual crisis was brought about in traditional monasteries and spiritual centres? Certainly not by coddling and consoling mediocre disciples. That is why very few people went to those centres. The moment you stepped in the door, there was a guy waiting with a stick. He took all of your clothes, all of your money, all of your belongings, put you in a little cell, gave you brief instructions about the 4 or 5 things you were going to be allowed to do for the rest of your life, and then demanded you do all 5 before dinner. You found out how you were failing to function by trying to function, by living under the conditions where nothing but functioning was allowed. Spiritual life is a demand, not a form of therapy. It is a demand under the conditions of satsang, the relationship to the Guru, divine communion. It is the practice of life in a world where the living heart, not your own dilemma and search, is the condition. The demand itself does not make real sadhana possible. It is satsang, the prior condition of truth, that makes it necessary. Satsang, or divine communion, contains and communicates itself as a demand. And this demand acts as an obstacle for those who are not certain about their interest in this radical life. They have read a little about it, heard a little about it, and now it tests them in the fire of living. Such is the way it has always been. The monasteries, the ashrams, the schools of teachers in the past were conceived like fortresses in the hills. They were difficult to get to, and very few people ever returned from them. People didn't gaze nostalgically at the place upon the hill, or hear about it on the evening news and say, "Wow, I wish I could just go up there." You know, turn on to where it's really at. Go up there and everything is groovy forever. Great macrobiotic food, and my mantra, man, and really get it on. Traditional spiritual life was never confused with any sort of playful getting high. All of that is only a mediocre interpretation, fabricated by people who have no real capacity for sadhana or the true and radical bliss of conscious existence. Spiritual life is not getting high. From the human point of view, the resistive, narcissistic, ordinary human point of view, spiritual life is the most completely oppressive prospect. And it creates massive resistance in such people as soon as they get a taste of it. Traditionally, incredible obstacles were put out front so that people would not bother even to come to the door. It was purposely intended that people would never even ask about it unless they had already overcome tremendous resistance in themselves. The great Oriental temples, for instance, were built with incredible images of demons, guardians, and ferocious beasts surrounding the entrances, so that people would not approach such places in their usual state of self-obsession. Their heads were required to be bowed. The devotee was expected to be crushed within, in a humble state, reflecting awareness of his habit of living. The devotee was expected to arrive on his knees and never without a gift. Such people would never come irreverently. They would never display an inappropriate attitude. The traditional ways of approach are perhaps too ritualistic and too purely symbolic. They can be superficially learned and imitated, and so they do not necessarily reflect the inner attitude. Just so, all must realize and demonstrate the appropriate and genuine manner of approach and life in our ashram. Every poor man is welcome to come here, regardless of his present state of life. I am not here to throw poverty-stricken people into the street because they can't pay the dues. But Narcissus is not allowed to play here. He is not supported. He is abused. He is called names. He is cursed. I put on masks in front of him. I say and do idiotic things in his company. We haven't created an artificial environment here in which everyone is supposed to be Simon Pure. We have nothing to defend. We can all know one another very well. That is one of the freedoms of such a place as this. So people here are generally very out front with one another about their nonsense. And that is perfectly all right, perfectly allowable, because it is a righteous demand for relationship. It is a purifying demand. Spiritual life is such a demand. It hurts at times. It puts you into confusion. It creates conflict. It makes you feel ugly. It makes you recognize crazy things about yourself. It forces you to function in spite of your refusal to function. It offends all of the self-imagery that you have built all of your life. But, after all, that is what we are here to deal with. Everything a man brings to the heart to defend is destroyed. Everything he defends is undermined. His game is not supported. It is aggravated. And people often become aggravated in this spiritual relationship with me.